It's honestly surprising to me I've gone this long on my channel without ever actually doing one of these, but it's time I finally got around to it. I've been listening to Decibel, a dubstep label, for a very, very long time, and within the community it's relatively common to do these kind of ranking videos of certain EPs or albums. And recently there's been a decent amount of discourse over whether the Knights of the Round Table albums that the label does every year kinda suck. Some people think they've always kind of sucked. And I mean, I will say this much, I think that ironically enough, it's usually the quote-unquote smaller releases on Decibel that end up being the better ones. Just the Roundtable EPs are usually the highlights for me, and a lot of the bigger name releases and big albums tend to be a little bit worse on average in my opinion. That being said, I don't personally think that Roundtable albums were always this bad, and I also think that the most recent one, Volume 6, although I've only had one listen to it so far, sounds like it's starting to get better. If you force me on the spot right now without thinking all that much about it, I would say that Volume 3 and Volume 2 were both very, very good albums, and Volume 1 was also pretty good. But I think that Volume 4 had a couple standouts, but the rest of it was pretty trash. And I think that Volume 5 was extremely forgettable with almost nothing of value in it. Whereas Volume 6 is sort of at a midpoint, where I'd say it's not quite as good as Volume 2 and 3, but it's starting to get back to the quality we had in the good old days. That is my current take, but I'm going to be re-listening to these albums a whole lot to do these rankings. And for now, let's just stick one album at a time and start with Volume 1. Now, there are a decent amount of people who actually think that Volume 1 is the worst album in the entire series, which caught me off guard because while I did say earlier I think that 2 and 3 are the best, if I had to pick one, I think 3 would be my favourite one. In fairness, Knights of the Round Table Volume 3 also came out almost immediately after I started watching Decibel, so it could just be a timing thing. But there were genuinely some times, depending on where my taste was at, that Volume 1 was my favourite album of them all. And certainly I never thought it was a bad one, so I was kind of caught off guard that this is a relatively common sentiment that the first Knights of the Round Table kind of fucking sucked. So, did it suck? Well, I mean, that's the point of this video, let's find out. I'm going to be giving all these tracks a score from a scale of 0 to 100. I want to make it clear that no track is going to be getting 100, I'm going to be very strict about anything above 90. It would actually have to be the kind of track that I'm going to remember practically forever if it's a 90 plus. And I genuinely don't know if I'm ever going to give a track a 100 because that would imply it's perfect. Also, I know it kind of goes without saying, but I just want to throw it in there. Unfortunately, there's a lot of variance with music. Some of it has emotional appeal and that really muddies up the scores. Some music is better listened to in the background and some music is better actively sitting down and paying attention to it, and that also screws with the scores. I'm generally going to try and make it an even playing field, but I will say this, I will dock a little bit of points on your track if I think it is cool to listen to in the background, but it's not as good to sit down and actively listen to. But I'll only dock a few. There's a lot of tracks in these albums that I thought were trash the first time I heard them because I was sitting down and actively doing not much more than literally just listening to the music. And so a lot of these tracks really didn't impress me. But then later, when re-listening to these albums while doing something else, some of these tracks I started to like a lot more just as background music, rather than something to just sit down and give all your attention to. I still think generally, I mean, it's more impressive and shows more skill on your part if you can make a track that's actually engaging to sit down and pay attention to, which is why I'm going to give more points for that. But I do think it's valid to make tracks that, you know, you're not necessarily supposed to do that with and you're just supposed to like listen to in the background. And so I'm still going to give, you know, points to those tracks. I'm not going to dock too many for those tracks. But yeah, I do have a preference for the more flashy tracks. Oh, and one last thing. This is going to influence my score a little bit for some tracks. I would much rather you make an absolute train wreck so long as it's interesting, rather than you make a competently made song that has absolutely no identity, no new ideas, and does nothing to actually make me remember it. At the end of the day, I would much rather you make something extremely wacky and stupid and dumb that's produced awfully, because at least then I'll have a good laugh and it'll stick in my head, and you know what? Maybe it'll even give me some ideas and inspiration, even though it's bad. I would genuinely, objectively bad but interesting stuff is better as far as I'm concerned than stuff that is objectively fine, but subjectively, from the perspective of being interesting and having ideas, it's like you're a robot. You have no original thoughts. What the hell are you doing? Please do something interesting for the love of God. All right, that's enough preamble. Knights of the Round Table, Volume 1. Let's go. We're going to go in the order of the playlist. starting off with 12th Planet, Barely Alive, and Phase 1's track, Send It. Obviously, we're starting off with the big names here. We got 3 well-known artists, especially Barely Alive, all signed to Decibel, you know, all official representatives of Decibel, not just, you know, people who are coming on for this one album. And this is a track that is pretty well-remembered, generally. That being said, how does it hold up? Well, I think it's a decent track, but I don't think it blew me away. In fairness, though, it's being held to a very high standard because of the fact it has so many big names attached to it, so that's not at all to say this track is bad. I'm going to give this track a score of 76. The sustained reeses and screeches in this track sound great. They absolutely burn. They sound like they're searing. They've got a pretty unique texture to them. And these wubs that come in after the initial impact have some really pleasant, unique, shiny and metallic aftertaste to them. The texture here is just very unique. But while I'd love to give a really detailed answer as to why I don't give this track a higher score, it's actually pretty basic. It's just a little bland. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's got some new ideas, which is why it gets a 76. But a lot of it is just, oh, the texture here is relatively unique, but like the kind of structure, the kind of ideas, the bass, the big picture, it's pretty bland. There is some more, you know, creativity going on in the smaller details, but that's about it. And it also just feels a little bit empty at times. I remember that was like the first thing I noticed, because I initially, of course, since I started with Volume 3, I'd heard the remix of this track before I heard the original. And that was the main thing I noticed when I heard the original, is like, wow, this sounds empty compared to the remix. There's like moments where there's just a lot of dead air. Like there's a bass there, but then there's nothing filling out the rest of the atmosphere. It's just kind of, it feels like a bass in an empty room going off, if you know what I mean. It doesn't actually make the track bad, but it just does make you think, they could have done a bit more here, Next up is Dubload's and Answered, Sludge Monster. And this track is going to get an 80 for me, a pretty high score. It's got a unique and atmospheric intro that I really like the vibe of. It's got a very gritty and bassy mix that makes things hit real hard and be really satisfying to listen to. And the tonality of these basses is always kept coherent, despite how insanely aggressive the bass design is. That being said, sometimes the gritty mix does become a bit much for such a long and slow-paced track. You know, a lot of these really aggressive and gritty sounds aren't so bad when you aren't hearing them all the time and they come in and out real quick. But a lot of these sounds don't really come in and out real quick. They're sustained for quite a bit because the track is slow paced. Because this track has a slow lumbering pace to it, a lot of these sounds are held for quite a while. And as well as that, almost all the sounds are this gritty and aggressive. And so as a result, your ears don't get that much of a break. Now, it's nowhere near as bad as some other tracks where it's a huge problem. Here it's just a bit of a nitpick. The more concerning issue in my opinion is that the main growl is very well made, but it's overused, especially considering it's usually spamming the same note. It sounds like a small thing, but even if it was just playing some different notes instead of row, 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 you know, over and over, it does get a little bit grating, especially again, considering how long the track is. That being said, overall, this track is very, very well made. It's got a unique vibe to it. The bass design is on point. Really not many complaints to be made here. Just maybe a little bit more creativity, a little bit more cleanness at portions for your ears, not all the time. Generally the grittiness is nice, but just moments where your ears get a nice little break would be nice. And lastly, although this track is nice and bassy, sometimes it is a little bit too muddy and heavy on the low mid end, so maybe just a little bit more highs at times would be nice. Boy Kid Cloud Beast, featuring Skis on the vocals. Listen, I knew we were going to have to get to this eventually. I am not a fan of rap. I'm not going to actively say your track is shit if it is a rap track that just so happens to have a dubstep drop, but it's not going to appeal to me. It's going to be a tough sell. And I don't know, the rap sounds okay here, but it's not selling me on this track. And that's a problem because... What the fuck is this drop? Did you try? This sound design is just brain-meltingly bland. This wub is extremely light and weak. The mix is trash. It's claustrophobic, but somehow it still doesn't hit right. How do you get your sounds hyper-compressed, but not feel like they have weight to them? How does that happen? It gets a score of 15, but hey, on the bright side, you can't do worse than that. Right? Graphite School of Gangsters. Alternative title: Help, I couldn't name my track. Okay, but in all seriousness, as much as this track does just scream, I had no idea what to call this, but I have to make it sound cool. Especially considering, as you might be able to guess, the theming of the track does not at all align with the title. Let's just judge this track on its own merits. Like its forgettable intro, its underwhelming initial drop, and generally the mix, well, not being bad, but just being a little bit quiet. So far, I probably make it sound like I hate this track, but this is just me being a little bit bitchy at the start for the sake of doing a little bit of a fake out. I actually love this track. This is a very Graphite track to start. Graphite has a very distinctive style, and this track absolutely shows it off. When I listen to this, I don't need to see the name Graphite on the screen to know Graphite made it. And that's great. I love it when I can tell the style of the creators I'm listening to, and they don't all just mold together like, oh right, this is rhythm producer number 562 who makes the bwomp 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 sound the exact same way that everyone else does. So that's always a good sign for me. As well as that, despite the underwhelming beginning of the drop, the longer the track goes, the drop just keeps getting built upon non-stop, becoming ever more creative and complex with each passing second. And that's how this track gets salvaged. Trust me, if that initial drop was all there was to this, I would be giving this like a 30 or something, maybe even a 20. I would be giving this a really low score. Because that initial drop is a massive letdown, but everything they add to it from there is constantly creative, beautifully syncopated, extremely satisfying to listen to. It is a bit of a rough start, yes, but from there it's nothing but uphill. And I'll also say this, I have a massive soft spot for people who actually make their tracks develop over time. There are way too many people out there who will make a drop, and then they will copy paste that drop with a slight rhythm change for the B section, and they will copy paste that A section and B section to make their second drop, and maybe, I don't know, they'll change the drum pattern and not change anything else because they're lazy and they don't care about actually making a cool track. I'm sorry, I know I'm being harsh, I know it's possible to make a really cool drop, but it was just so much work making that one drop that you've got to copy paste it, and hey, it's so good you want to listen to it again anyway. I know that's possible, but at the end of the day, generally, I take it as a sign that you don't care about your track, so I shouldn't care about it either when you just start copy pasting for your second half. And the fact that Graphite very rarely seems to do that and often seems to be one of the best artists out there when it comes to making their second drops, their B sections, sometimes even their C sections be unique and actually develop upon what they had before, it's just, oh, that's definitely something I'm always going to appreciate. Some of the fills in these drops are really unique. The growls have an immaculately intricate texture to them. Even the alarm-like sustains that they have this nice quality to them where they feel a little bit muted on the high ends. Which would usually be bad. It would kind of make it not have the right kind of impact to it, make it feel a little bit wet and muffled. But here it helps them sound less annoying because of the fact that, well, they're high-pitched alarm sounds by design, while still keeping all the power of the intended sound. And the sense of momentum behind the flow of this track is just always on point. Like, the track is always heavily swinging into the next bar with some real force behind it. As a result, no question, giving it a score of 85. And now we make it to the first Chibs track. One of the first places where things are going to get messy. So if you've never heard of Chibs, Chibs is a dubstep producer, or I don't even know if what he produces would still fall under the dubstep label, but sure, whatever. Bass music either way. That makes usually more chilled out tracks that usually have some extremely complex and squelchy basses. And I like that. What I don't like, and what most people don't like about Chibs, is that he also tends to make one bass, even if that is usually a good bass, repeat the same rhythm and melody on that bass over and over and over and over and over and over and over, and somehow turn that into a 5-minute long track. And this has caused a massive divide, where there's a decent amount of people who are like, how the fuck is Chibs even a well-respected producer who constantly gets on these compilations? How the fuck is he continuing his career? This is like trash. He literally makes one bass every track, and that's his entire track, and then he just repeats it for 5 minutes. What the fuck? But then I think there's also a nasty tendency for the opposite to happen, and the people who like Chibs to then be like, nah, you don't understand. He's actually a gigabrain genius. Actually, in reality, the reason that he repeats the same bass 5 million times over is because he had to consult his friend NASA scientist to figure out the exact frequency at which to apply the resonator to this wub to get this pitch just right, to get the texture just perfect, so that he can make the god bass right here. And you just can't understand how intricate his sound design is. And it's like, you know, I kind of find myself not really lying on either side of this fence. I hate to be a fence sitter, but I really am here. I'm not gonna lie, I just feel like Chibs is okay, you know? That's about it. I think his tracks are kind of hit or miss. Sometimes he makes a bass and it is genuinely so good that, you know what, as long as it's not like the only thing I'm doing, as long as I'm doing something else while I'm listening to it, I am fine to sit here and for multiple minutes just sit here and listen to the same extremely satisfying bass, just go wow, wow, or whatever, if it is really, really, really well made. Some other times the bass is not really that unique, doesn't really warrant a whole track, and they still want like drag it out to 5 minutes, and I'm like, yeah. I'm always going to generally like appreciate less repetitive sound design, so I'm not saying that like it's good that Chibs is repetitive. I'm not going to pretend that him being repetitive and constantly reusing the same sounds is exactly a sign that he's really good. You know, I think his tracks would be better if he didn't do that, but I'll give him credit where it's due. At the end of the day, I do think that he has some of the best sound design out there. It's just that he doesn't do much with it, if you know what I mean. I mean, when you listen to tracks of his like Sharingan, they just sound amazing, and I don't mind listening to the same bass for nearly 5 minutes straight in that track because it's just one of the best basses I've ever heard in my life. But all that to say, we've gotten to our first Chibs track, so I had to get all that out of the way. And the first track containing Chibs is going to be Monks and Chibs, Creamo. Now, this track is not as bad as most Chibs tracks when it comes to repetitiveness. There's a decent amount of little switch-ups here. It also has a really well-maintained, chilled-out vibe to it, and I really like this robo-vowel sound here a lot in the B section. That being said, this main bass is a little bit weak, especially for how hard it needs to carry. It's a bit lacking on the low end and light feeling. There's no interesting texture to it either. It's just kind of smooth, and it is nice and smooth, but like, that's really all it has going for it, is that it's smooth. It's not very complex or intricate. I mean, this might be unique to you if you've never heard a Chibs track before, but if you have heard Chibs tracks before, you've heard sounds like this before, and you've heard sounds like this before done better. So compared to his other tracks, That being said, as much as I hate to give this a score that's relatively high technically, after I just said all those negative things, and I do think, man, this is a bit repetitive, at the end of the day, I can't lie, I do like listening to this when it's just in the background, so I'm gonna give it a 61. Dirt Monkey and Shank Aaron. Who the fuck comes up with these names? Okay, what it is, featuring Born Eye on the vocals. Not gonna lie, not exactly excited to see another track with a bunch of rap in it, but let's see if this time it's good.
Hey, what it is right now. I ain't really playing with you kids right now, so before you stand up, better sit back down, try to treat me like Simone when they flip my step.
Well, I guess it's okay, I guess. It's catchy. And you know what? This one little distorted Go sample on the offbeat in the drop here, it's really nice, I think. But that's where all the nice things I have to say about this track end. That's the drop? Wait, no, seriously, that's it. That is the drop. You cannot be serious with that bass design. It's got a claustrophobic and hyper-compressed mix, and figuring out how to make a wub was not impressive enough to warrant an entire track built around it, even back in 2017 when this released. Please, for the love of God, just try something original. I'm giving this 11. That might sound a little bit harsh, because I did say, hey, the rapping's okay, you know, it's a little bit catchy, you know, it's pretty fast and that's nice, and hey, you know what, like, it's slightly competent, I guess. It's structured in a way that works. But you know what? No, I don't want to give points for doing the bare minimum. I want to give points for you being creative and showing me something new. And you didn't show me anything new here. In fact, you showed me something old, and you didn't even do it well. So, fuck you. 11.
$100,000 on the wrist right now, but I'm open to the present like a gift right now. Everybody feeling sicker when I spit my style. Now they hearing all the realness when they click my dial.
Next up is Myro Shut the Fuck Up. That's just the name of the track. And, oh boy, another kind of worms we've got to get into here. Myro is one of the people on Decibel. In fact, I believe he's the owner of Decibel. It's him and Fusky, I think, both own it. Either way, but you don't hear much from him, even though, you know, he's one of the biggest, most important people there. And as far as I can gather, the reason for that is because he mostly handles the business side of things, and he doesn't really produce that many tracks anymore, except when there's an alliance or a roundtable occasionally. And the reason why, as far as I can tell, seems to be because he's very much an old school producer. He makes older style dubstep, and, you know, times have moved on. It's not like he can't make tracks anymore, obviously, but you know, it does seem like that's probably why he doesn't produce as often. And the reason why Myro is a bit of a can of worms, just like Chibs is, but honestly Myro might be worse for it, is because of Myro's fans, I guess. Listen, I don't mind if you like Myro tracks. I don't think Myro's a garbage producer or anything. I think he's fine, but he's not one of my favorites. I think a lot of his tracks are very competently made, but once again, because they're kind of old school, a lot of the sound design has kind of been there, done that for me. So it's like, I can listen to it and be like, yeah, clearly this guy knows how to make music, but also, he's not really interesting me, even though I can tell that he knows what he's doing. That's how I feel about Myro tracks a lot of the time. But the trouble is that people who desperately cling to the aesthetic of old school dubstep are fucking insufferable. I'm sorry. It's not even a thing of like, oh, old school dubstep is bad. That isn't even my point. I don't even dislike old school dubstep, really. The problem is the attitude people have about it. When you find someone who's really into this aesthetic, usually they'll very much have an attitude like, everything's shit these days, the old days were better, this is the only good music, and they will literally sit there and if you point out mistakes or bad aspects of the old music, they will literally sit there and be like, but you don't understand. That clipping in the mix, that poor mixing right there, or this extremely questionable sounding percussion that does not have a nice impact to it, these extremely poor decisions in the production of this music, actually, this was all intentional to capture the correct old school vibe. And so literally, you'll see things that are practically outright mistakes in tracks usually, and almost guaranteed not intentional, but then you'll see people who are old school dubstep fans sit there and be like, no, you don't understand. You don't understand early 2010s or late 2000s dubstep. You don't get old school dubstep. You have no idea how it works. Yeah, you see that really insufferable gatekeeping know-it-all attitude, and you know what, I will admit, I think part of the reason why it gets under my skin so much is because I actually, you know, fucking make dubstep. I'm really passionate about dubstep, and I don't even dislike old dubstep. I'm really fond of it because a lot of the dubstep tracks that got me into dubstep were very much old school style dubstep tracks. Even though I guess, you know, I would have been getting into it in the early 2010s, a lot of the people that when I was first discovering dubstep that I listened to were still more kind of a bit more classic dubstep style. So, you know, it's got a place in my heart and all that. It's not like I don't care for it. So yeah, don't get me wrong, I get that you probably learned something for listening to dubstep for like 20 years plus, but at the end of the day, for me, I've still been listening to dubstep for like nearly 15 years at this point, so I'm not far behind, and on top of that, during that time, I've not just been listening to it, I've been fucking producing it since I was 11, you know? So it's kind of like, you know, I understand it's a smaller period of time, but in that period of time, I've kind of put a bit more work into understanding how this works. And so, you know, when I see people who just listen to dubstep, but want to talk down to people like they understand everything about how dubstep works, and actually all these things that are mistakes in the production are actually just big brain moves to capture the old school vibe, you just kind of sit there and you have to be like, you really fucking think that this is like you being gigabrain here? This is you understanding music far better than everyone else? What's the point of this gatekeeping, you know? But anyway, just so you know, I don't have a personal problem with Myro themselves. I don't think Myro condones any of this necessarily, and I haven't heard his word on any of it. But yeah, I definitely hear a lot of it focused around his tracks. Not always him, but obviously since he does the old school style dubstep tracks, of course, a lot of them are going to be around him. So that was a massive can of worms. With all that said, this is a good track, actually. Yeah. You might have been like thinking you're bracing for impact for me to say, yeah, I really fucking don't like Shut the Fuck Up, because you know, it is a Myro track, and I will say, in fairness, I do think most Myro tracks are pretty mid, but this I think is Myro's best track, no question, not even close. I mean, it's a basic concept. It's pretty unambitious. That's probably one of the negatives. And the other negative would be you're only really going to hear two kind of sounds in this bass, bit crush wubs and bro step rises. So, I mean, if you're going to get sick of that, that might get on your nerves. But other than that, it's nothing but positives. The texture of these speaking basses are just delicious. The touch of bit crush is just perfect, not sharpening the smoothness of the bass, but also helping to make the bass sound a little bit more solid and less sloppy. So you get the best of both worlds. The melody's very catchy. The snares are on point. Listen to that fucking impact, that's great, and the mix is great. Score of 82. It's a great track overall. And honestly, I don't think it's controversial to say that it's Myro's best track. I think most people are on the same page. I think that Myro cooked here. So yeah, I mean, if you are a fan of Myro and you're a bit like worried about that big spiel at the start, hey, there's your proof. I'm not here to be a fucking hater. If Myro cooks, he cooks. He made a good track here. Ulasil, Planetary Federation. Well, let's just start with the positives. It's an Ulasil track. Listen, I'm not gonna lie, since I mostly stick to Decibel, I haven't heard that many of Ulasil's tracks outside of Decibel, but everything I've heard on Decibel, for the most part, nothing but bangers. I don't think Ulasil's made a single bad track, and the tracks he's made that are good, like, they will live in my head forever, rent-free. He's got a very, very distinctive style. His sound design is just so, like, metallic, crunchy. It's very hard to describe, but his texture is on point. So as expected, you get some insanely creative and unique sound design and a massive variety of cool basses on show here in Planetary Federation. Here's the problems, though. In fact, there's quite a few of them, which is why this track is only getting a score of 75. Because, really, default Ulasil track is probably getting 80 plus. But there's a few problems with this one. Unfortunately, structurally, this track is a bit of a mess. It feels like a collection of randomly spammed cool fills rather than a coherent track. Like, they don't actually have any meat to it. It's just a bunch of sounds that are supposed to go from point A to point B, but there's no actual middle point. It's just ups and downs and lefts and rights, but no actual thing going on in the center, if you know what I mean. Very, very slow paced as well. And it somehow manages to feel repetitive despite the variety on show here. Like, from an objective perspective, there is an insane amount of different sounds going on here, and there's an insane amount of variety here, but somehow the track still feels kind of samey and repetitive despite that, because it's just such a mess of sounds that all kind of blur together in your head. As well as that, a lot of these sounds, while very cool and creative, they are also sounds with grating high-frequency clicks and screeches, which alone may have had an impact, but when spammed this frequently, become kind of grating on the ears. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit for the sake of making a point. It's really not that bad, and there are other tracks on this album which are far worse for that. But I'm just saying, you know, the default here would have been an 80 plus. It's all these other unfortunate downsides that drag this track to being 75. But 75 is still very good. That's a good score.
The Federation of Planets.
Oh boy. I think this one just might be the most controversial placement in this entire album. Fizo, Stagger. Now, I haven't heard many of Fizo's tracks. From what I can tell, I think if I remember correctly, he's usually on Never Say Die, not Decibel, although he showed up a couple times, so that might be why. But I will say this, the few things I have seen from Fizo has been nothing but bangers. I have not seen Fizo make a bad track yet. That being said, I heard a lot of people really didn't like this track. This often ends up towards the bottom of most people's rankings when it comes to the tracks in Knights of the Round Table Volume 1. So, you know, I wasn't sure what to expect going into this. And especially when the intro was a little bit slow and a little bit repetitive and there wasn't much melody going on, more just kind of establishing atmosphere, I was like, oh boy, yeah, this could go bad. And then it began. Okay, So as much as it is a bit of a slow start, the atmosphere is on point, the theming is on point, and this is a very unique track overall. Aside from maybe being just a bit too wet for its own good, the main bass has a great impact and rhythm to it. We have some aggressively glitchy sound design as the track progresses, like the track's constantly breaking apart as it tries to continue. And this is probably the best execution I've ever heard of a hyper-syncopated drop. As far as I'm concerned, I give big points for being on theme. I know that to some people it might not be a big deal, but I really think it shows you care about your track and the, feel you're supposed to establish when you actually make your track and title and theming all very coherent. And the idea of making a dubstep track around the feeling of being staggered is a really cool and appealing one to me. The title instantly caught my interest, and the main thing I was worried about was that it would just be a generic dubstep track that's just called Stagger, but doesn't actually feel themed around it. But no, this entire track feels staggered. It feels like it starts off on rough footing, and the whole time it's trying to catch up and is breaking apart. After all the horror stories about this track, I'm not gonna lie, I think this was a highlight of the album, and I have no idea what you guys are smoking if you think this track is bad. The sound design here is great. The rhythm here is probably the single best syncopated rhythm I have heard on Decibel. The concept is unique. The atmosphere is on point. The theming is on point. What more do you want? I'm gonna give it a 90. Ivory, 93 style, with Virus Syndicate on the vocals. Oh god, not another rap track. They've all been trash so far. Okay, so we got some extremely generic bass design, extreme lack of variety. Why the hell is this track 5 minutes long if you had so few ideas? And I mean, what is this extremely faded detune chiptune ARP even doing in the back here? Like, this does not fit with the theming or vibe of this track at all. What is it doing here? Okay, I'm being really miserable, so how about I change that? Credit where it's due. The rapping from Virus Syndicate isn't just okay here. It is actually pretty good.
I was tricked, I was duped, I was misled. Now I'm getting closer to the cliff's edge, and I see that ahead there's a sheer drop. Nothing left in my heart but a teardrop. Fear not, man, I'm trusting my instincts. In my mind is a map.
I actually like it. Honestly, probably the highlight of the track. And you know what? For as harsh as I've been, the build-up's sick. The emotional violins are actually amazing and would have gone insanely hard if they had led into a better drop. And even then, while I said the drop is super bland, well, it's not badly made. It is very competently put together. Everything may be a little bit conceptually boring, but it does just simply sound good. And this little B section switch up is pretty good in fairness. So, you know what? I've been a bit of a dick so far. I'm gonna be a little bit nicer with this track, because I'll admit, while I really didn't like this track when I had to sit down and listen to it for 5 minutes straight first time, and I wasn't really doing much else but listening to it and paying attention to what was happening in it and thinking, wow, this is fucking boring. When I came back to listen to this album multiple times, re-listen to all these tracks, and I was just, sitting playing a game while it's playing in the background, I was much less bothered by how bland the sound design is and how repetitive the track is, and I actually started to enjoy it and want to listen to it, willingly actually listen to it again. So you know what? That's enough to give it a 59 in my book at the very least.
You ball liquor, ball liquor, ball liquor, ball liquor, ball liquor.
Murder, Ball Liquor. Listen, I know this is a very well-known and beloved track on Decibel, but I don't see the hype. The sound design is harshly metallic and the mix makes it nice and sharp, but this track would only feel unique to me if I had never heard a Murder track before. But when you compare it to the rest of his discography, it lacks any identity. He's already known for this kind of sound, and that's kind of all this track really has, except the funny voice lines, I guess. I just don't feel much listening to this track as a result. So yeah, it's not even that it's a bad track. I'm going to give it a 55. It's okay. It's just, it doesn't interest me. And so I don't even really like talking about it because it's just kind of like, yeah, it just didn't interest me. Oh, this one's also going to be a little bit controversial. Definitive. Decibel. This is only going to be a little bit controversial, I think, but when it comes to people's bottom pick, it seemed like this was a popular one. When people talk about the worst track from Volume 1, a lot of people say it's this one. And I am not gonna lie, I am not on the same page. I don't think this track is good. I'm not gonna argue that. I'm gonna say this track is mid, but like, I think it's worth listening to every now and then. So don't get me wrong, this track is very laid back, it's a little bit repetitive, the sound design isn't groundbreaking, and the way it's mixed, although it does make it laid back, also means a lot of these sounds don't really hit very hard, they all feel a little bit distant. It's kind of the opposite of what I was expecting. For a track called Decibel, I was expecting it to be hyper compressed and really in your face, and it's kind of the complete opposite. That being said, while the sound design isn't groundbreaking, the textures here are quite unique and intricate. As well as that, I'm not gonna lie, this rhythm is really catchy to me and very fascinating. I don't know, it just feels nice to listen to this over and over, and even when I'm making music myself, sometimes I accidentally find myself falling into the decibel rhythm because it's just so stuck in my head, despite the fact that the track as a whole is kind of forgettable. So funnily enough, this is not even the only time I've done it, but this specific track right here is what I'm talking about. This is initially just supposed to be a bit of practice so that I could make better drums, but I accidentally actually made something that sounded kind of good. But because I didn't have any plan for it, it's also a little bit generic, and so I kind of don't know what to do with it. I'm not going to lie, I've had this just sitting in my folders for literal years, and I still don't know what I want to do with it. But yeah, either way, it might not instantly sound like the decibel rhythm, but like the longer you listen to it, you might start to realize it kind of is almost the same rhythm. But I'll play it now anyway. I may as well just put this out here while I'm here anyway, because I don't know what else I'm going to do with it. To be honest, that end bit there is probably just me messing around. I don't think I'm actually going to use that, but yeah. Yeah, it might not be immediately obvious, but like it's not the exact same rhythm, but it's kind of similar to the yoy 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 of Decibel with the wham 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 boom. You know, I can't. It's a bit awkward. I have to do it with my mouth, but you know what I mean. Hopefully. So yeah. This one rhythm, though, I don't know. This yoy 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 yoy. Oh god, don't let anyone hear me doing this. No, but seriously, that rhythm really gets in my head, and I feel like it's a really satisfying rhythm and a really good rhythm to build off of. The flow here is absolutely immaculate. It's just the everything else is missing. But still, I'm not gonna lie, I kind of find this track a bit of a guilty pleasure. I'm gonna give it 48. Don't get me wrong, that's still below average, but it's pretty close to average. Infect. Glock Dance. Christ, man. How did you do it? How did you manage to do worse than what it is? Welcome to the worst track of the album, people. I have no idea how most of the people I saw reviewing this album thought this track was okay. This is a train wreck. God, I'll admit, I'm not usually a fan of Infect's style. You know, Infect's a bit similar to Chibs in that he usually has very complicated basses, but makes them really repetitive as a result. But you know what? Even still, there are some Infect tracks I really like. I mean, Tendo's an obvious one. A lot of people love Tendo, but there's even ones I don't hear people talk about that I really like. Like, for instance, I actually think Private Suite is a masterpiece. No one ever talks about that track. That is Infect's best track as far as I'm concerned. And you know what? I know that there's a decent amount of people that don't like The Elephant either. I love The Elephant. It's not that I simply hate Infect and want him to fuck off. No, Infect can make some good tracks, though generally, you know, he falls into a bit of the same camp as Chibs, and if I had to pick between Chibs and Infect, I think Chibs is a little bit better. But this isn't just, oh, like, Infect's a bit hit or miss and this is a miss. This is the biggest miss I think Infect has ever done. I don't think I've seen an Infect track anywhere near this fucking garbage before. So okay, this intro is absolutely barren with nothing going on. This drum beat is weak and unpleasant, and because this is Infect, there is only one bass. That one bass is not even impressive though. It is extremely basic and unoriginal. It is not deep and girthy, it is not meaty, it doesn't have a satisfying buzz to it. It's just a basic little wubby Reese. Nothing in this track hits hard, nothing in this track has any impact, there's barely any melody to speak of at all, and there are plenty of long sections in this track outside of drops where the only thing playing is the ass drum loop over some out of tune and barely audible ambience. And the flow isn't even good, man. It's extremely unnatural, slow and plodding, and not even creative. Jesus Christ. 2 out of 100. How did you fuck it up that badly? Alright, I believe a palate cleanser is in order. Dodge and Fusky, Excalibur. Well, let's start with the bad. Just get it out of the way. You're not going to hear much in the way of unique sound design here. Dodge and Fusky do tend to have a bit of more, not as old school as Myro, but, you know, a slightly more old school vibe to them, so, you know, you do see the kind of basses you already know. And although I like the classic acid bass sound they use in this track, you know, I'm a fan of this sound, I do think when it's used in slower tempo tracks like this repeatedly and not as a quick sound effect, it does start to sound a little bit annoying. But other than that, we got a lot of good things to say about this track. The mix here is great, the build-up is sick, I really like the vocal clips used in this track. Basically every bass has lots of weight and impact to it. Excalibur. So do the drums, and wow. This growl is just chilling here in this track at this bit just before it goes into the B section. And I am so sad it isn't used more. This growl is insane. It's sharp and squelchy, but somehow it still hits like it has a really meaty weight to it, despite the fact that the sharpness and the squelchiness usually should counteract that and make it sound a little bit limp when it comes to the weight behind it. I'm giving it a 73. Pretty good track overall. I mean, I'd give it more, but it's just not that creative. But what it has does very, very well. Samplifier, Daud. At least I assume that's how it's pronounced. I have no idea what this title is. Alright then, let's wait, what the fuck am I listening to? No, seriously, what the fuck am I listening to? What is this intro? What the fuck are these vocals? Oh god, what is this drop? Christ, Samplifier, what did you do? I actually like your style usually. What is this? Okay, in fairness, I think these bass lines are good, believe it or not, but they're ruined by the track that they're put in. You see, over the course of multiple re-listens, I've realized that these bass screens actually have some really unique glassy metallic textures to them. They also have some real force behind them. The problem is that when you make a whole track that's nothing but extremely forceful and sustained, glassy, metallic, screaming basses, well, you get a mess of screams. What were you expecting? It doesn't even sound like you have these insanely, really well-made scream basses anymore now, because everything in this track sounds like that. Everything sounds like it's screaming. So instead of it sounding like you have good sound design, even though you kind of do really, it just sounds like you have shitty mix and poor taste. Genuinely, take some of these basses and put them in a different track and play them for more reasonably short intervals where impact is actually needed, and I think they'd sound great. So yeah, gets a score of 18 from me. Not very good. Or minus. Skulltag. Okay, let's get the good out of the way. This is actually a very sick intro, I'll give them that. And credit where it's due, the basses in this track are going to be sufficiently meaty. But, well, let's just get right to it. Let's rip the band-aid off. Let's get to the drop. Come the fuck on. I can't keep doing this "what is this drop" bit for every track, but like, what do you want from me? Oh, top comment, by the way. Old school as fuck. Rip all the people who don't know Or Minus well enough to understand the genius in him deciding to make the song this way. ... This is why I hate the old school dubstep aesthetic. Ugh. There is no value in this track beyond nostalgia. Listen to this sustained bass scream and tell me its texture is interesting. Tell me with a straight face it isn't a bland, unmoving screech that sounds like a mistake in production that just got left like that. Like they accidentally cut off the automation clip and forgot to finish it and thought, whatever, we'll just leave it like that. This is going to sound a little off topic, but let me pivot for a second. This is why I will go out to bat for Dodge and Fusky's track from Alliance Volume 6, 10 Years Too Late. If you're not familiar with that track, the vast majority, the popular opinion is that track was a fucking train wreck and it was shit. But you know what? It was an interesting train wreck, goddammit. Okay, I'm being a little bit facetious there. I obviously do sincerely enjoy the track on some level. I don't think it's an amazing track. I think on an objective level, there are some things it does that are very questionable. But the whole point of that track is to make something really fucking weird with old school sound design, but make something new with it. And so you get this drop. And don't get me wrong, if you want to sit there and tell me, yeah, this drop is shit, I can completely understand. But can I ask you this in response? Have you ever heard a drop that sounds like that? Because I definitely haven't. And you know what? I'm glad I at least heard something different by listening to this track. So you know what? Every now and then, while I'm definitely not putting it in my playlist, while I'm not listening to it on repeat, I like to listen to 10 Years Too Late, because maybe it is a little bit of a train wreck, but you know what? It is a fascinating train wreck that I actually like to listen to because of how weird and different it is. To me, this track is the anti 10 Years Too Late. It's like, okay, let's do an old school dubstep track, except let's keep all the shit stuff from the past and let's change nothing for the better. Let's keep the sound design extremely boring and predictable and doing the same things we were doing 10 years ago. Let's also not clean up the mix at all. Let's also not do anything to make these textures a little bit more interesting. Even if I give this comment the benefit of the doubt, even if this comment is saying, listen guys, Or Minus is holding these screams on purpose at this extremely static and boring and unpleasant on the ears point, because that was how old dubstep sound design was. Well, this kind of illustrates my point for me. Because this is why trying to go back to the past doesn't necessarily give your track any value except nostalgia. The reason why older dubstep tracks would have been more prone to take screechy basses like this and just hold on them, even though they don't even have an interesting texture, is because at the time, dubstep wasn't as developed. And so, sound design like this would have actually been kind of interesting and groundbreaking. Now it's generic and boring. And the reason why is because we've heard it before. The reason why you don't hear this in newer tracks isn't because people forgot how to do it. It's because it's bad. It's because we can do better now. It's not like you don't see tracks anymore that have sustains with screechy basses like this anymore. You do sometimes. But the thing is, now when we do that, we make sure it, I don't know, actually has an interesting and dynamic texture to it instead of an extremely static like your computer crashed or something. So yeah, with all that said, for this track to work, it would have needed to be carried by the melody. But not only is there not much of a melody to speak of in this track, but it's also extremely repetitive. You can't even say, well, sure, it's repetitive, but it's pleasant and catchy, because the basses playing it are almost always sort of out of tune, which makes the tone sound very annoying and unsatisfying. So yeah, bad track, gets a 12 from me. It might surprise you to hear this track was really hard to score, honestly, but here we go. London Nebel, Express Yourself. So here's the thing, I really didn't like this track on the first listen, and it's for some very, very boring and very, very predictable reasons. This track has one bass, and it is so fucking repetitive, man. But I've come around on this track. The main bass's texture is genuinely perfect, I can't fault it. It manages to maintain a gritty and metallic texture despite the fact it's also just wet enough. And it's very tuneful, so it always sounds smooth as silk no matter what note it's playing. The flow's on point, the drum beat is immaculate, and the little percussive touches everywhere help add a little bit of life to the basic starting point for this track. I feel weird about this. I feel almost spiteful that I have to give this track a score this high, because I really don't like these really repetitively structured tracks. But I also can't lie, I mean, I like listening to this when it's on in the background, when I don't have to sit down and do nothing but focus on it. It does just sound good, you know? It's just catchy, it sounds really good, the melody's really nice, it's just very well made. You know, I hate to say it, but I think I gotta give this a 65. I gotta say it's pretty good, begrudgingly. Oh, we're getting close to the end now. Yax and Ad Astra. Broadcast. I've never heard of either of these guys. Anyway. Okay, let's start with the good. I like the rhythms going on here. I think the sound design is a little more original here and relatively well done. And the B section of the drop is definitely a highlight. Here we get into the bad, though. Not a fan of this intro or bridge. You know, it's a little bit unpleasant on the ears, very uneventful, not much going on, feels a bit empty. All the basses, aside from some of the more clicky ones, so to speak, just feel a little bit light and unimpactful as well, like they're a little bit faded. And the big one, this track triggers one of my biggest little hang-ups about dubstep tracks. I have a huge pet peeve about something, and I don't hear people talk about this very much, but oh, to me, I hate it. I hate it. It's an instant turn off for me. It's an instant thing that just tells me, oh, I might not like this track. And that is tracks that feel the need to span pitch bending to get interesting modulation. And it's for two reasons. For one, as far as I'm concerned, pitch bending is not interesting modulation. Not unless, you know, it kind of makes sense in the context. You know, obviously, I'm not saying pitch bending at all is a bad idea. If, you know, you've actually got a context in which the pitch bending gets across the right vibe, it gets across the right kind of motion, whatever, or it's used sparingly, fair enough. But when you feel the need to pitch bend everything every couple seconds, I'm going to have a problem. And it's not only because pitch bending is the lazy way to modulate something, it's actually difficult and requires a decent amount of thought and knowledge of sound design to be able to make a new texture for your sound. So how about instead of actually changing the timbre of your sound, you just, I don't know, wee with the pitch. Yeah, that'll convince some people that maybe you're actually doing something cool rather than just wiggling a knob back and forth. I don't know, man. I know I sound like I'm being really, really strict about this, but just to me, and I know that people won't literally do it thinking of it this way, but like to me, it really feels like when a producer starts like spamming pitch bending, it's like the equivalent of someone dangling keys in front of a grown man's head and expecting them to start babbling like a baby, like you know, just like oh, shiny thing shaking, you know. It's the same thing here where it's like, ooh, lasery thing going pew 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 pew. And again, that's fine if it's actually got like a texture to it, if it's the timbre that's changing, but if it's just the pitch going wee wee wee, it's It's like, no, fuck off. Actually make a melody. Actually make a texture to your sound. Actually create a timbre. Actually engage in some kind of sound design and coherent, you know, composing. Don't just woo, woo, woo. So yeah, that's a big pet peeve of mine. There's another reason why I hate it as well, and that is if your pitch is constantly bending so much that you barely ever have it sit still, that also makes it really hard for our brains to subconsciously interpret the notes that are being played, which then means the melody of your track starts to sort of collapse. And once the melody of your track starts to sort of collapse, it's like, oh, okay, so you don't have chord progression really anymore, you don't have a melody, you don't have really anything. You kind of just have rhythm, and don't get me wrong, rhythm's nice, but when you have like no notes to work with, it's just kind of like, oh, up, down, up, down. I guess that's the better way to put it. When you spam pitch bending, instead of having all the meaning that you can get from chords, from like harmonies, from different intervals, from different melodies and all that, you lose all that meaning and you crunch it all down to, oh, we're going up, oh, we're going down, oh, we're going up, oh, we're going down. And not only does it make the tracks way more boring and less distinct, but also it makes it just really fucking annoying. Generally, our brains are just tuned to find things that go up or down in pitch instead of staying a consistent pitch, just fucking annoying sounding. And so when a track just constantly goes up and down and up and down, it's like, Christ, man, I'm being a bit harsh. This track does do a lot of pitch bending, and I wish it did less of it, but it doesn't do that much. I'm being a bit over the top here. But I'm being a bit over the top because I'm going to bring this back up later. Either way, all the other downsides unfortunately drag this track down to being a 38, but hey, at least it's not quite as trash as some of the other lower score ones in this list so far.
Go ahead, Yak, solo.
Oh, fuck yes. Here we go. We got to the Virtual Riot track. Virtual Riot Degenerates. Now listen, I'm excited for this because every single fucking time Virtual Riot brings something to a compilation, he brings the fucking heat and he blows everyone else out of the water. So I can't wait to hear what he's got in store for Decibel Roundtable Volume 1. Oh no. Come on, man. I was relying on you to bail this comp out, man. Nah, man. Okay. I actually like the intro. I wasn't expecting this sort of emotional piano thing at the start, but it does sound really, really nice. And you know what? I actually like most of the basses in this track. The fills are great, and this like little barely alive growl style thing, that's really fucking satisfying. I like it. In fact, I want to give this track more points almost because those things exist. I just won't because you can hear them in almost every other Virtual Riot track, and so like, why would you go to this one, you know? But yeah, let's address the elephant in the room. The main bass just fucking sucks, man. What is this? And the other issue is related to the first issue because it's a reason why the main bass fucking sucks. This track also spams way too much pitch bending, and it does it a whole lot worse than Broadcast does. This track gets on my fucking nerves, man. I want to headbang to it, but I can't because it's always going, and it's like, oh my god, just pick a fucking note and stick to it. I'd get more into it, but I kind of already went on my rant about pitch bending, so yeah, this is where it culminates. Super disappointed here, man. Virtual Riot usually brings the heat, but he really dropped the ball here. Chibs, Earthworm Slim. Apparently he gets 2 tracks in this compilation. Well, let's get the obvious out of the way first. It's a Chibs track, which means 2 things. 1, it's super repetitive, and 2, it's way too long. But I'm not gonna lie, I think this track is really fucking good. The bass's textures are on point. The sound design here is intricate enough to hold my attention. The rhythm is unique and satisfying with constant switches going on, and every part of this track just hits right. And they really committed to the bit on the theming wonderfully. The comical sound effects actually managed to be funny, immersive, and also genuinely pretty cool sounding all at once when put together like this. Just overall, an extremely solid Chibs track. I would say this, if you don't know whether you're gonna like Chibs' music or not, I would say listen to this track, and if you like it, I'm sure you're gonna find some Chibs tracks that you like, because this is like peak Chibs right here. But hey, if you don't like it, then fair enough, I doubt that you'll find any other Chibs tracks that you really like. Marauder Wicked, formerly Mastodon. He changed his name. I used to like this track. I really liked it on first listen. Now I'm not so sure. The basses are very hard-hitting and aggressive, and the sound design's interesting, but it's got a bit of a claustrophobic mix again here. I don't know what it is with Decibel Roundtable Volume 1, but like almost every track has a very claustrophobic, very compressed mix. And I mean, I'll admit, I can't talk. Mix is my weakest point when it comes to my productions. I mean, I feel like I've improved a lot on that, but even still, I've still got a ways to go. But I don't know, it seems like a lot of the times, professional labels, they don't struggle with this so much, and I don't know, it just feels weird that there's so many mixes that just feel a little bit unpleasant and claustrophobic in this first album. I also don't really like this vocal sample. This might sound really nitpicky, but it just doesn't flow into the drop well, and I don't understand why they keep spamming it, because it isn't satisfying. It doesn't quite hit, you know? I also don't know, are they just saying wicked wanna? Like, what? Anyway, I genuinely struggled to put my finger on why I couldn't enjoy this track all that much, because it felt like it was really cool the first time I listened to it, and just the kind of thing I'd be into, and I did really like it first listen, but it just really didn't stick past the first listen. And I think it's down to two things. It reuses its basses too much, for one, and for two, it just struggles to feel like it's ever going anywhere because there's no melody to speak of, really. It just feels like a bunch of rises and downers being spammed, which kind of runs into the same problem I was talking about earlier with the pitch bending. It's not as bad as that because you actually have some interesting textures here to work with at the very least. The timbre actually changes, it's not just the pitch going up and down and the timbre remaining the same. But still, it's the same overall issue of, rather than having all the meaning that you get in chords and melodies and all that kind of thing, you instead just have, oh, we're going up, oh, we're going down, oh, we're going up, oh, we're going down, oh, we're going up, and then, oh, we're going down, and it's like, okay, right, you know, we kind of need some feeling of tone here, we kind of need something to make us feel like this is actually going somewhere and it's not just up, down, if you know what I mean. Ugh, we're not ending on an easy one to score, I see. NATO feels, bottoms up. So let me take you through the experience of listening to this. Oh my god, nothing is happening in this intro. Please stop making intros like this where there's just extremely boring ambience and just percussion and then are constantly spammed and repeated. Where? Oh, we're building up. Just get to the fucking point or actually make a chord progression or melody. But then we get into the drop and it's like, oh, hang on a minute. Wait, hang on. This bass is sick. Wait, this rhythm is pretty cool too. Oh, wait, the drums are pretty good too. And then you go back down. Oh, but this is kind of boring and repetitive, huh? I guess this is the thing with this track. Bottoms Up easily could have been an 80, maybe even a 90 plus. If this track had more of a proper melody and progression accompanying the great bass and rhythm, it could have been an absolute banger. As is though, it does feel a little too much like it's 10 seconds of a banger, and then they ran out of ideas, and so they had to find a way to stretch out the 10 seconds they have into a 3-minute track until the quality of the track as a whole gets cut in half by how hard and how thin they have to stretch the good part they have. So, unfortunately, I think I have to give this track a 58. Still above average, you know, it's a really good bass, it's just, it can't go above that. Well, that concludes our ranking. So if you are curious how these all stack up from bottom to top for me, at number 22, way at the bottom with a score of literally 2, is Glock Dance by Infect. And then going up we have What It Is, Skulltag, Beast, and Daud, acting as the bottom 5. Then you get Broadcast, Decibel, All Liquor, Wicked, Degenerates, Bottoms Up, 93 Style, Creamo, Express Yourself, Excalibur, Planetary Federation, and Sender. with the top 5 being Earthworm Slim, Sludge Monster, Shut the Fuck Up, School of Gangsters, and Stagger. You cannot convince me that Stagger is not the literal best track in this comp. And so having said all that, let's get to the real interesting thing. What was the average score when you add all these scores together? The average score was 49.8, almost perfectly mid, which I will admit that was lower than I was expecting. I was expecting it to be somewhere around the 50s or 60s. In hindsight, both actually scoring all of these tracks and also having to re-listen to a bunch of them over and over for this video, I think what I've realized is I think I know now where the divide comes from, where I kinda still like this album, but most people thought it was one of the worst roundtables ever released. I think it's because I don't usually just listen to the whole albums. Usually I listen to the whole album one time, pick out all the tracks I like from the album, put them in their own separate playlists, and then listen to them. You know, I already filter out all the tracks I don't like from the album, or all the tracks that I have to be in the right mood to want to listen to. And I think this album has a lot of bad tracks, I will fully admit. I mean, literally the entire bottom 5 doesn't even get past a 2 out of 10. And even among the mid tracks, a lot of them are tracks that are good only if you're in the right mood, and garbage if you're not in the right mood to listen to them. I'd say that applies for Express Yourself, Creamo, 93 Style, Bottoms Up, hell, even Wicked. So in hindsight, I think the reason why I like this album a lot more is probably because I don't just sit down and listen to the whole album. Sitting down and listening to this album as a whole is exhausting. Not only because there's so many bad tracks to get through to get to the good ones, but also even the medium tracks, even the tracks that are just okay, a lot of them are only good if you're in the mood for them. And if you're just listening to the whole album in a big row, you're probably not going to be in the mood for a lot of them. Either way, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll get to continue this series and move on to Volume 2. I think that Volume 2 is going to be a little bit better. I will say I've already re-listened to Volume 2 for the sake of preparing for the video, and it already turned out to be better than I remembered. I remember there being a lot of trash in Volume 2, while the good really stood out. I remember there being a lot of bad tracks in Volume 2. When I went back to re-listen, almost every track I remembered being really bad, I actually sort of liked when I went back to listen to it, so I have a feeling I'll have a much higher score on average for Volume 2.